So I got rushed in that last little segment. Segregation occurs naturally, sort of as de facto segregation, where demographic changes happen, migration happens. For example, in California, we have groups of people who come and they settle in a neighborhood, and then they invite other people from their home, wherever that is, like Thailand or Korea or Mexico or Afghanistan or Armenia. They settle in these little areas. Well, they're segregated, but it sort of happened by chance or just was. That's de facto segregation. De facto segregation is not as easily fixed, if you want to say fixed, as something like de jure segregation. Where de jure segregation is, there's a law that was passed to separate groups of people. De jure segregation is clearly a violation of civil rights or liberties, whereas de facto segregation is a little bit more difficult to figure out. And so when we try to fix some of those things, to try and ensure that everybody's treated equally. For example, in a de facto segregated city, you're going to have schools that are largely of one racial ethnic group, or at least dominated by a certain racial ethnic group. Now, what happens there? Well, it's not really clear. Is that happen by choice or by chance? Do they receive the same treatment? Well, in Brown versus Board of Education, they said we can't treat people separately the same, so we have to integrate them. Well, one way to fix that has been affirmative action. Affirmative action was a policy that was to provide advantages to individuals who haven't previously experienced the same advantages. So, in other words, to address previous discrimination. This is contentious because in terms of equality, we have this concern about, well, is everybody treated equally because they have the same equal opportunity, or are they equally treated because they have the same outcome? Now, this is a concern between different political parties, but mostly this becomes a contentious problem as we try to implement it. So as we try to implement these policies, there's a question of if we implement them is actually reducing equality in the process. So there are all these concerns about rights and liberties, and they're very valid concerns because we want the process to be equal. We want the outcome to be equal. And so, for example, you can't have quotas for admitting certain students because that means that they're not all judged on the same merit. But we can use that as a portion in terms of admissions. These are very, very fraught questions because they deal with the core of liberty and equality, the things that we hold dear in American political culture. Now, civil rights and liberties, whether or not we're excluding government from intruding on us or we're using the government to ensure equality or fairness, these become really problematic as we try to make sure that we achieve these sort of cultural ideals of what it means to be an American. Now, what's interesting is the same pattern that was used for African Americans to secure civil rights and equal protection have been used for women and other groups. So, for example, efforts to secure the right to vote for women, leading to the 19th Amendment. Extending civil rights protections in the workplace, protections in classrooms, control over their own bodies, freedom from sexual harassment. These are same sort of ideas that have occurred. They've all been borrowed from the same sort of lawsuits and precedents that were established under African Americans. Now, there's questions now continuing about whether transgendered rights follow the same sort of thing, or whether or not there's a sufficient group of people to have new sets of civil rights extended to them between like racial, ethnic, religious, gender identity. All these are real concerns because every group that feels slightly discriminated against or has a reasonable, sense that they've not been treated fairly, they should have the same rights extended to them. So we have all sorts of questions that continue to revolve around equal treatment and equal rights. We can talk about rights of women, where that came from, Title IX, access. We have even today questions about intersex individuals being able to participate in athletic events, whether or not they're biologically male or female, if their testosterone levels are too high, if they've made a choice to transition from one gender to another, what sort of rights and liberties are extended to them. All sorts of questions about how courts intervene, whether or not there's a compelling interest in the government to intervene in those issues. And you should look at those standards, strict scrutiny, immediate scrutiny, and reasonableness standard, whether or not these things are extended to individuals. Now, the biggest, broadest themes on these two lectures that I've given are about individual liberties, which were protections against government interventions, and civil rights, which are protections given from government to individuals, and how those have all played out. Another couple key things to think about are whether or not those Bill of Rights that are protections against federal government intrusion should be applied to the states, and that's a process called a selective incorporation. You should go through the text and look at how that process has occurred through legal suits and law changes, because this is fascinating in terms of how we identify and define groups, whether or not you have aggrieved individuals, and how we ensure equality and fairness and liberty, both by preventing government intervention as well as having the government actively intervene on the behalf of individuals to protect others.